Hello. Today I'm going to walk you through the different diets dairy cattle are fed depending on their age. I am also going to spend some time discussing the concept of phase feeding. I didn't realize how complex this topic was until I began researching and gathering all of my information. So this presentation, although it is longer, it is just scraping the tip of the iceberg that is dairy new cattle nutrition, as there are so many factors that go into establishing the best diet and rations for the most production efficiency. For this presentation, I'm going to walk through the three main timelines in a dairy cattle's life, specifically birth, weaning, and maturity. Once I reach maturity, I will then introduce the topic of phase feeding, which breaks down the diets for the three lactating cows and dry period cows. Immediately after a calf is born, they are administered colostrum. Colostrum is defined as the mother's first milk. It is packed with essential antibodies and the primary nutrients the calf will need for its survival. Once the calf is born, they need to be fed at least 4 quarts of colostrum within 4 hours. Most calves will nurse on their mother, but there are about 25% of them who will not. Either way, farm management needs to administer the initial 4 quarts. Even if the calf were to nurse immediately, there is no way of knowing how much they received. Within the next 12 to 20 hours, they should be fed at least 2 more quarts of colostrum. At least the first 4 feedings need to be strictly colostrum. This is because within 24 hours, a calf's gut will close off completely, not allowing for any additional antibody absorption. After supplying the calf with the initial colostrum, usually around day 4 up until the calf is weaned, they can be fed different milk forms to continue receiving the necessary nutrients while their rumen is developing. This type of milk fed is determined by price, availability, and convenience of the operation. For this time, they should be receiving 2 quarts 2 to 3 times per day. They should also begin receiving starter grain and water into their diet. Calves will begin by just nibbling at the starter, so should not receive more than 6 ounces daily. The starter intake will usually increase by around 3 to 4 weeks of age. Water should always be present for the calves, as free choice water intake will increase the starter intake and then in turn lead to weight gain. It is important that calves at this time are not receiving hay. This first image shows a rumen from a 6-week-old calf fed strictly milk. This next image shows a 6-week-old calf fed strictly milk and hay. As you can tell by both, they have little to no texture. From this next image, you can see a great deal of papillae growth and development. This comes from a 6-week-old calf who is fed milk and starter grain. This is ideal to maximize the calf's ruminal efficiency for when they mature. It is also very important to note that calves should be weaned when their starter grain daily intake reaches 1.5 to 2 pounds or by weight, but not when they reach a certain age. After weaning and through maturation or first insemination, it is important to keep the calves in small groups of similar age and body weight. This is important since they have been spending their first few weeks of life in an individual calf hutch. Now they must learn to socialize and eat in a group setting to minimize any future risk of competition. During this time, the greatest portion of a calf's diet should be forage. Most, if not all, of their energy will be derived from these forages. This is best delivered as a total mixed ration. As you can see here, as the calf's growth increases, the dry matter intake will increase. Crude protein will also increase. And once the calf reaches 250 kilograms, they should be receiving 100% of their dry matter intake as forage. Once a cow reaches maturity, there are certain physiological factors that must be evaluated to understand what the ration makeup should be. The first is the milk production curve. The second is dry matter intake, and finally, body weight and gain curve. These 3 curves are then combined together to form a collective figure that can be broken into 6 different feeding rations. These 6 feeding rations are collectively known as phase feeding. Phase feeding is feeding based on stage of lactation. This figure I will utilize throughout this presentation to give a visual of the timeline. Some phases will not match up exactly to what I will describe, but this is because phase feeding can differ between farms by preference. Again, I will bring up this figure throughout each phase and we'll walk through the differences in rations for each. Phase 1 is the ration designed for far-off dry cows. These cows have been just recently dried off and will be in this phase until 21 days before their calving date. During this time, the cows will have the highest body condition score, lying usually around 3.5. This is due to the growing fetus and the excess energy not being utilized for milk production. Phase 1 is one of the more important rations because it will determine how well the cow does in the next lactation cycle. This phase is also the cheapest phase because the ration should be mainly forage, with less than a third of the ration being concentrates. Phase 2 is designed for the dry-off cows 21 days prepartum to calving. There are 4 main goals that should be aimed at during this time. The first is to adapt the rumen to a slightly higher concentrates diet, as once they calve, they will be entered into the lactating herd and fed a higher concentrates diet to produce the greatest milk load. The next important goal is to maintain calcium levels. This is extremely important as the risk of a cow developing milk fever is the highest within the first 48 hours postpartum. During this time, the body is not producing enough calcium to utilize for milk production, so it then begins pulling it from bone stores, which leads to a very sick, unstable cow. Building a strong immune system is also important, as the immune system postpartum is left very vulnerable for the first week or so. Maintaining a positive energy balance can also help reduce any risk of metabolic disorders that can be caused by a negative energy balance. Phase 3 is fed to cows immediately after calving until 2 to 3 weeks postpartum. During this time, fresh cows should be separated from the larger lactating herd in order to monitor their vitals and ensure they are handling the larger concentrations loads in their diet. This time is an essential intermediate between the close-up and the lactating herd. During this time, the ration should still keep up a healthy level of fiber while avoiding high starch levels, which could lead to off-feed risks. Now, just reviewing these first non-lactating herd phase diets, you can see, as I mentioned, the fiber values are the highest in the early dry cow ration, also known as phase 1, and then begin to decrease as the balance between concentrate and fiber is skewed more towards concentrates. As a result of the decreasing fiber levels, the crude protein levels are increasing. Another value I did not mention on as much on the past 3 slides is the dry matter intake value. This value decreases during the dry cow period due to the large portion of the cow being taken up by the growing fetus. It then jumps greatly for the fresh cow as there is a large load loss once the calf is born. Next, we will jump into the final 3 phases, which can be classified as the lactation phases. These are based off of protein and energy levels the cow must consume for optimal milk production. The energy levels revolve around the stage of pregnancy and the composition of milk, specifically the fat and protein. A pregnant cow needs extra energy for maintenance and the development of the calf inside her. The energy requirements become significant only in the last 4 months of pregnancy. As you can see here, farther along in the pregnancy, the metabolic energy increases greatly, as does the total digestible nutrients. The protein levels depend on size, growth, milk production, and stage of pregnancy for the cows. As you can see here, the farther along in the pregnancy the cow is, the lower the requirements for crude protein are, which explains why there is a much lower amount of concentrates in the diet during the dry-off phases. The next phase is designed for the early lactating cows, or cows 14 to around 100 days postpartum. This is the time period where there is a peak milk production and peak dry matter intake. This is also the period where there should be the lowest body condition score. This is due to the lack in fetus and amount of energy utilized to produce the peak milk. The main goal of this ration should be to maintain that peak milk production for as long as possible. Once there is a dip in the peak milk production, they should be moved on to the next phase ration. Phase 5 is designed for cows from around 100 days postpartum or when there is a noticeable decrease in milk production and weight gain has begun, and it usually lasts until around day 200. Cows should be fed around 4% of their total body weight a day, and around 2.3% of their body weight should be concentrates. Phase 6 is from day 200, or when there is a substantial body condition score increase, to dry off. Cows should be gaining weight to replenish the adipose tissue lost in early lactation and the growing size of the fetus, as they should be pregnant by this time. As you can see in the chart, the slope for dry matter intake and milk production yield tend to match as they are both decreasing. Protein and energy sources are not as important during this time since the milk production yield is at its lowest. Because of this, there is an increase in forage levels in the ration, which means a reduction in feed costs for the production facility. Now we take a look back at that same chart I showed after the non-lactating phases, but now we're going to focus on the lactating phases. As you can see, the dry matter intake peaks at the early lactation, as it should since the peak milk occurs during this time. There is also a decrease over time in crude protein, which can be explained by the decreased need for concentrates in the diet once the peak milk production has passed. The fiber quantity dips down in early lactation and then rises again in later lactation, as I explained to you in the previous slide. These are the resources I utilized when putting together this presentation. I realize this does not even begin to explain every part of the cow's diets and rations for their entire life, but hopefully it does summarize and explain clearly the major points. Thank you so much.